And all of this led to, essentially one of the biggest regrets of my entire life this far.
It's very common uh, to play the woulda, shoulda, coulda, if I'd only, maybe things would have been different game. And I played that game a lot after he died. If I called the night that he wasn't answering my text, could I have done something about it? I mean, there's just all these things that always go through your mind. And the reality is that we don't know.
I just said a lot of not great things to him. And then I left. I think in that moment, a little bit of compassion and understanding would have gone a lot farther than what I ended up doing. We say things that we don't mean to people that we love because they've hurt us, and sometimes it's because in that moment, whether you know it or not, you want to hurt them back.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going. All right. So welcome back. I think we're just gonna hop right into it. So um at the end of the last episode, I came downstairs and found him drunk. Um, and I could
After
tell,
he'd been sober for
yeah, for
a
months.
couple of months. Yeah.
And of course, kind of like what we said before, um, as soon as you and I both knew what was going on with him in the first place, like there was no way that he was going to be able to sneak it anymore without us noticing. And that
No.
was exactly what happened is, he was trying to sneak it, trying to get by because he knew you were going to be working all weekend, night shift. So you're going to be sleeping during the day and working. I was supposed to go to my friends all weekend. So like he kind of had the weekend to himself at home. And as I was getting ready to leave, I came downstairs and he was obviously intoxicated. And I confronted him right away. I was like, I went to say goodbye to him, and I was like, "Have you been drinking?" And he goes, "No, no." And I was like, "Yeah, you don't lie to me. Like I can tell." And he's like, "No, I'm just tired." Like trying to play off the sleep thing again. I was like, "No, like I know you well enough at this point. Like don't lie to me. Have you been drinking?" And he kept denying it. Kept denying it. I said, "Okay, fine." And I was pretty mad at this point, like internally.
Yeah.
I kept my cool in that moment because I think he just expected me to just leave and like leave him alone. And so I went and like started packing up my car, and so I walked through the garage and everything, and I knew that he previously had been hiding his stuff in the garage. So I went and to go search, where he would always go. And I didn't know where he normally would hide it, but I knew what I was looking for. So I knew I was looking for some form of alcohol, and I'm searching around. Probably took me 20 minutes, and I found a half empty bottle of vodka back there.
And
And
where? Oh, yeah, we're not telling where he had it because we don't want no ideas for other people. Never mind.
um,
It was it wa it I'm gonna tell you it was ingenious in terms
yeah,
of, but I don't
it was.
want to encourage others who are struggling to have a new hiding place. And I will say, if you are a person who is struggling with having a spouse or a family member that you suspect might be doing this and would like to know maybe where to check, and maybe they have some weird garage habits, you can reach out to us via our email and we can share it with you. But publicly, I don't think we need to be putting that idea out there.
Yeah. Um, but anyway, so I find it, and I think at that point I called you, and you were like just getting to work or just at work or whatever,
Yeah.
and I
Overnights.
base I basically was like, "Dad's drinking. I found the bottle in the garage. I'm I was about to leave and I came down, I basically told you the whole story, and I was like, "What should I do?" And you said, "Well, I'll deal with it in the morning, like just dump out the bottle and whatever." And I don't remember exactly what you told me to do, but I remember I went out to the front yard and started dumping out the bottle. And as I was doing that and on the phone with you, he came out through the garage door, like through the from the house into the garage, and like opened the door and saw me pouring out the vodka. And I saw him and I held up the bottle and said something along the lines of like, "I found it, you lied to me," and then I threw it away. And he just kind of like, I could tell he was feeling guilty, and he just kind of shut the door and went back inside, and I don't remember. I essentially ended the conversation with you and was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I was pretty upset and very angry with him. Um, and
And rightfully so. Uh,
yeah,
I
yeah. I
think the
mean,
thing I think
so
the thing that was hardest about this whole situation for both of us is that this man had been in my life for 20 years. He was your dad for your whole 18 years of life, almost 18 years of life. And this man had not lied to us before. He had not kept things hidden. He was not deceptive. He didn't do that stuff. And so to have this totally different person to have emerged in this last handful of months, that was a very short period of time, that was someone that we didn't recognize on lots of levels. And we're dealing with the hurt and the betrayal that comes with, I've just been lied to for months and months and months. You being angry, especially because again, now the secret was out, right?
well, and I
We
and I
all we
confronted
knew
him,
what was
and I
going
gave
on.
the thing was is I confronted him and I gave him multiple opportunities to come clean and just say, "Yeah, I made a mistake," or whatever, and he chose to lie to my face.
Right.
And that
But
was
also
really
let's
hard, but well,
caveat that that
let me
is part of that's part of the disease. Not saying that
that's what I
invalidates
was
your feelings.
that's
Yeah,
what I was
sorry.
getting to is I just wanted to preface, like, obviously now I know that, like, anytime basically with any addiction, relapse is a thing that happens. It's almost 0% of the time that somebody's going through, trying to get out of addiction of any sort without having a relapse or two.
And it can happen
Relapses,
after being sober for 20 years, you can relapse.
yep,
It is
yep,
part of the recovery process. Relapse
yep.
does not mean failure. It's how you
No,
deal with the relapse that matters.
right. So, but I didn't necessarily know that at that time either,
Yeah.
that relapse was a part of this journey. So, I thought things were getting
I
better. I
didn't
thought things
either.
were done with. And and so then suddenly in my mind it was like, "Oh great, he's back into it fully." It wasn't just like, for me, it didn't feel like it was just like, "Oh, just a one-off thing, like we'll get through this, we'll fix it." It was, "Oh, you're fully back into hiding and lying and drinking." And like I thought we were past this kind of deal. I know better now, but I
And
didn't at that
well,
point.
and again, why wouldn't you feel that way? Because your entire life he was the opposite.
Right.
So
And
it
so this whole situation, this whole relapse, the first time he the first time that we knew about that he had relapsed, to this level where he was obviously intoxicated. About half a bottle of vodka was done. He clearly saw that we were both going to be pretty much MIA for the weekend, so he knew he had the weekend to himself. He knew he could hide it. Um, and so of course I was pretty livid. I was very upset, and all of this led to, essentially one of the biggest regrets of my entire life this far, which is that I went inside and I had a conversation with him. and I was not nice to him. Um,
You were angry.
and well, yeah, but still. Um, and I I said a lot of things that I think he probably already felt about himself. Um, and that I really didn't truly feel. It was just in that moment, that's how I felt. Um, but the way that I treated him that night is definitely one of the biggest regrets of my life. I called him a child. I said I didn't respect him anymore. Um, I said that, you know, I said that I still loved him and I cared about him, but like that that I thought that he was weak and had no self-control, and because of that I didn't respect him anymore. I said that he was acting like a child and that um I just said a lot of not great things to him. And then I left. I didn't stick around. I left and I went to my friends for the weekend. And I left him with that. And it's become one of my biggest regrets because I never had the chance to resolve that with him because 3 weeks later he died. Uh I never had the chance to readdress it or to tell him that that stuff wasn't true. And I think about like how, again, thinking back now, how in pain he was and the things that he probably told himself on a daily basis, which probably were much worse than the things that I said. But now, him having, you know, that moment of me saying those things, um, now he had the added aspect of confirmation or validation that even my son thinks these things of me. So why shouldn't I? And it's, I mean, like I said, it's my biggest regret in my entire life is that conversation that I had with him because he didn't deserve that. And as bad as I was feeling, he needed compassion in that moment. He needed understanding. And I just put him down and probably made him feel a lot worse about himself. And one of the things that I've struggled with the most over um, over the last however many years is, I mean, feeling guilty for one thing, but also just wondering if some of the things that I said were going through his mind on the night that he died. Because and I left him there all alone for him to just sit in it.
Yeah.
I went in, I was mad, I said a lot of things that I shouldn't have because because he made a mistake. He was trying so hard. He was trying so hard to be better and he made a mistake and I reamed him for it.
Yeah.
And and I never got to apologize. I never got to resolve it. And I can't help but wonder if I made things worse for him internally.
I
Um,
Yeah, I don't know if any of us will ever know the answer to that. Um I hate to see you upset like this. I understand that feeling though of um there are things that I think about that I wish I had done differently. Um there are things that make me really sad about the stuff he was struggling with and the things that I missed. I think that it's very common uh to play the woulda, shoulda, coulda, if I'd only, maybe things would have been different game. And I played that game a lot after he died, as uh, if I called the night that he wasn't answering my text, could I have done something about it? I mean, there's just all these things that always go through your mind. And the reality is that we don't know. We don't know what would have happened or not happened. And the one thing that I can tell you is that, and this is harder, I think, for you to understand right now because you don't have your own child and you're not a parent. But I think that many other parents would agree with me on this, that no matter how much you might feel hurt that you've disappointed your child or that you've hurt them in some way or upset them or you feel bad about it, you also recognize that, like, they're reacting in the moment. There's a level of maturity that comes when you become older and when you're a parent, that you can see beyond the fact that, like, like they're angry, right? And they're expressing their feelings. Um, and I know for a fact, I know without a doubt that, like, if your dad were here, he may have thought that. He may have been thinking about that. It may have hit him in that moment. But in his healthy mind, if he had not died, if he was still here with us, he would have absolutely told you that it was not your fault and that he understood where you were coming from. And, like, I don't, you know, and I know that those types of things don't change the fact that it still sucks because you think about those things, that
well,
you
it's
could have
just
done differently.
it's just well, I remember part of that conversation being like, "You're supposed to be my dad. You're supposed to be the strong one, and here I am reprimanding you for you know doing something stupid and not being able to control yourself." And like, and I called him a child, and I said a lot of other things, but I think the thing that sucks the most about that is, again, like, I loved him so much. We were so close. Um, and looking back and knowing how much he was struggling and how much in pain he was, or how much pain he was in. Um, I just hate the fact that I added to it instead of taking away, especially in a moment that he did have some weakness and he did give into it. And again, in that moment, now it's shaped the way that I that that is a lesson that I will never forget, and it has shaped the way that I interact with people forever in terms of when people make mistakes, because he made a mistake. That's all it was. It was a relapse. It was the, it was a very normal part of the process, and I think in that moment, a little bit of compassion and understanding would have gone a lot farther than what I ended up doing. And obviously, I was 17 years old and didn't know any better, and had never gone through anything like this before, and didn't have the control of my emotions that I do now. But that doesn't change the fact that that's what I did. And it
Yeah.
doesn't change the fact that I wish that I didn't. Um, and it doesn't change the fact that he died, and I never got to tell him I was sorry for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of people who can relate to that, to what you've just shared. Um, I'm sure there are a lot of younger people who have said things to their parents and something bad have happened and they wish that that hadn't happened and they regret that, and
Or anybody in your life.
or
I know
anybody.
I The reason why I share that is because I know that that happens. That we say things that we don't mean to people that we love because they've hurt us. And sometimes it's because in that moment, whether you know it or not, you want to hurt them back. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's because you are angry and you want to see them better and you're too hard on them. And we all have been there. We've all done it.
Yeah.
I think in normal circumstances, it would have been resolved and we would have had a conversation later, and we would have, you know, probably been closer because of it, but that's not what
It's
happened.
because how yeah, that's because how we that's how we rolled, as a family. And I think for both of us, there was a lot of uh the hardest part of him dying was the fact that there was all this stuff that had just happened right up to his death.
That
That
was
was
all
so
still unresolved and
yeah. And
left us all reeling.
yeah, and you go back to the beginning of when we started this story. Not story, I mean, this journey, because it's not a story. This happened to us. This is the truth. This is true nonfiction. Um, and you know, we had said, like we'll get into it, but like him dying was complicated by the fact that there was all this stuff that just happened right before he died. Literally
And it
right
made
before he died.
and it made it so much more complicated with everyone else as well, because, you know, almost no one knew what was going
No,
on with our family.
no, no.
Um, I think
And not
outside
that
of
we
outside of your grandma, I don't think anybody had any idea
no.
that this was happening, and
Mm.
and
And
so
eventually I think we would
especially
have
after he
gotten
died, I was gonna. Yeah, I mean, eventually we would have told. We would have gotten to a place where more people probably would have known about it, people we were close to and whatnot. But especially after he died, you know, it added a whole other layer to our grief because we couldn't even talk about it yet, because we didn't like we've said before, we didn't want if what he had died from had nothing to do with what we had been going through as a family, Like, we didn't want to taint his memory. We didn't want people to talk about and got start the gossip mill about, all of these things that had happened, until we knew for sure, you know. And
It made it more challenging for us because we only could talk to each other and, maybe my
yeah.
grandma, but, yeah, it made that whole period of time while we were waiting for the autopsy results to finish to
Well,
get the final answer just
and then
challenging.
when he did die, well, you were talking to me earlier about how, you know, because of all of these things that had happened and because of his relapse, like, you were feeling worried the night before.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think that, I mentioned it in the second episode when we actually talked about, like, from the time we woke up to finding out that he died, and I said, I had you go first because I was like, there's some context that I have to sort of play into this scenario as far as, how we got to the point of like, me being concerned that something was wrong, um, and the night before we found out that he had died, I had had dinner with my sister, and, when I and again, we talked all the time, we text, even after all of this, we still had constant communication, even after knowing what was going on and him dealing with that stuff. Um, and it was like 7 o'clock at night, and he wasn't. I texted him to be like, "Hey, I'm done with dinner. I'm gonna go home." At that point, he should have been back in his hotel room, like, ready for the night. And again, he stayed an extra night. That wasn't, again, not abnormal, but, like, he was supposed to be home that day, but, like, he had stayed an extra night. And I knew he was dealing with this stuff, and I had a weird feeling, and I was a little bit concerned because he wasn't responding to me. And then I called him and he wasn't answering his phone call. But again, because he also does deal with this sleep issue. The thing about the sleep issue I want to make really clear too is that when we realized what was going on with him in terms of the alcohol, we could clearly distinguish after that between his legitimate sleep episodes and the ones that were induced by alcohol. Like, before we knew that was going on, they kinda all seemed similar, um, but after that happened, that's why when he said I'm just tired, you're like, "No, I can tell this is not the same."
Yeah,
W
I knew
once
immediately that that was not the case.
Right, so once we knew, it was like the light bulb went on, we went, "Oh, okay, so, like, these are the little nuancy differences that would happen because he still had sleep issues. He still had insomnia that was not being fully treated. He still had sleep deprivation. He still had episodes. They got better, as in, like, less frequent after he had stopped drinking because clearly the frequency of them had increased with the drinking. Um, but even within that, once he stopped drinking and we understood what was going on, we could very clearly immediately pick out, this is a sleep thing, this is an alcohol thing. Like, it just was so clear. Like, looking back, not even like from the relapse or anything, just looking back at his patterns, going, yeah, okay, so this was all alcohol related, but like these ones, you know. So he clearly still had this sleep issue. And I remember sitting there on the sidewalk in downtown Minneapolis waiting for my Uber, to go home from dinner, and I'm texting him like to say goodnight and touch base. I hadn't talked to him since that morning, and that was the morning that he told me he was going to be staying another night because he needed to take care of a customer issue. And again, not abnormal. He'd done that a million times. And it was like a legitimate thing that happened. It wasn't like something he used as an excuse to do whatever. Um, but I just remember texting him, not hearing back, calling, not hearing back, and having that weird gut feeling like something's off. And I hope he's not drinking. But I
Under the
also like don't
context of him just having a relapse a few weeks prior.
right. And also like but then also recognizing that it isn't abnormal for him to fall asleep early, and 7:30 was not technically early. He's fallen asleep much earlier than that, just because of the nature of his job and how tired he would get and the fact that he had sleep struggles. And I will say that that night I did debate. I debated if I should call, like, the hotel, if I should have try to get a hold of him through his room, if I should have somebody check on him. Like, it was a fleeting thought through my head, but it did occur to me. Like, it felt off, but I rationalized. So, like, you talk about, regrets, right? I regret not listening to that little niggle of a worry and, like, taking the extra step and maybe being a little extra because, I you knew your dad. Like, he would have been just mortified and, like, annoyed if he literally was just, like, dead asleep, and I, like, call the cavalry in at the hotel room and be like, "Oh, they're worried. They wanted to do a safety check on you." You know what I mean? Because again, this wasn't something that was also abnormal. I mean, like, it was such a conundrum for me because I was just like, it could be, but also am I being extra paranoid? And like, am I gonna be that person? And like, I can't you start to learn that like you can't when you're dealing with someone who's struggling with that kind of thing, you can't corral it. You can't control what's happening or not happening. You can't like they have to take the reins with it, and like you can't babysit them, and you can't like yeah, but obviously the next morning when I find out he died, I often even to this day wonder if I had called or like the hotel because I called his phone. It wasn't he wasn't answering his phone. I remember texting him, "I hope you're just asleep and you're not drinking because I'm a little bit worried that I haven't heard from you." I literally sent him that text. Obviously, it never got read, but like, yeah, I mean, to this day, sometimes I'm like, maybe if I had become one of those people and called the hotel and like made them go check on him and open the door and whatever, because to be perfectly honest, the time frame that I called him and texted him and tried to figure out what was going on, granted, and again, remember I hadn't slept for like probably 36 hours at this point because I had worked the night before, overnight, I was up the day before, and then I stayed up all day. So like I also was exhausted. Um and I often think like what would have happened if I had just done that, because the reality is and we'll talk more about this when we get into the autopsy and like the police report and all the details that we had. But he checked himself back into the last time he used his key card to get into his room was 7:40 p.m., like 7:40 or 7:41 p.m., and never left after that. And according to the coroner, the medical examiner, they estimated his time of death to be approximately 12 hours prior to when they found him. They found him at 10:30 the next morning in the morning because that's when we called them in. So theoretically, based on all of that, he died within a few hours of me trying to get a hold of him. So yeah, there is a level of guilt of like, again, should I have done more? Should I have been that person? I had a niggle of worry. Was I? But then, you go into the like, am I overreacting? Am I just, it's a really, it's a really tough place to be in. And I think that's why after a while you go through this place of like, shoulda, woulda, coulda, you could have done all those things and it still could have ended the same way. And like, sometimes just bad things happen, you know?
Yeah, I
Like,
think I think the important thing to remember, when it comes to that guilt, because it often happens in these sorts of situations when somebody dies, especially in some, um, in a very sudden way like this, or in a tragic way where it's not like illness that you're kind of expecting, a terminal thing, or old age or that sort of thing. When it's an accidental death like this, the people who are closest often feel the most guilty because they feel like they could have done something to change the outcome. And the reality is you don't really know. You could have done all the right things and it still would have had the same outcome. Like, there's no way of knowing, and dwelling on
it
all
was
of
an
that stuff.
accidental death.
Yeah, I mean,
So
dwelling on all of that stuff ultimately ends up fruitless because you can't change the past anyways, and all it does is cause you more pain. I think for me, you know, I don't think my that conversation would have changed the outcome of him dying, but I still regret it because that I was I wish that I was nicer to him. I wish that I showed more love to him. I wish that I was more compassionate to what he was going through in that moment, because even if he would have died the next, even if he still was going to die the way that he did, at least at least then I at least then I didn't say things that I regret.
yeah, I think it comes down to, again, this is where that professional therapy becomes very important. It's learning how to forgive yourself, right? Because my
That's
therapist
not
used to say
something
this.
I tend to be particularly good at.
I don't think a lot of people are good at that. We live in a culture where we're self-critical and we take a lot of blame on ourselves for things that we wouldn't blame other people for, or give compassion. I mean, we give compassion to all sorts of other people for all sorts of things, and yet we hold ourselves to a standard that it's hard to show compassion for yourself. And one of the things that my therapist used to say out to me all the time. Now, obviously, I have a different one because I don't live in the same state anymore, but um she would often, when I would start to feel really upset and sad and sometimes guilt, sometimes regret, sometimes just this feeling of like, I just wish I had done this differently or I'd done that. And she always had a really great question for me, which is true. And she used to say, you know him the best. And if he were sitting here right now and he knew everything that had happened, like, and that you were dealing with this feeling of guilt or regret or sadness about something you did or said and whatnot, what would he say to you? Would he blame you for this? Would he feel like it was your fault? Would he feel like you should feel bad about those things? And
Mm,
realistically, no,
The thing
he
is
wouldn't.
honestly, in this situation, knowing him, uh, he would be blaming himself. I mean, so much more than he would ever think to even, you know, think badly or blame us. Um, he would be so incredibly hard on himself for all of
Yeah.
this. If he knew the outcome, if he knew that he was going to die and everything that would follow in our lives and all of those things, like I don't know if he would ever forgive himself, and that also makes me really sad because it wasn't his fault either.
That is one of the one things I really struggle with, and that makes me very sad as well, is that yeah, this is just exactly what you said. But I do think that, like, realistically, I mean, we can feel bad for all the things that we did or didn't do, said or didn't say, all that stuff. But in the grand scheme of things, we loved your dad more than anything, and he loved us more than anything. And I think you and I have talked about this before, but we both know with certainty that had he known that the outcome of what would have happened and the way that this accident happened and all the things that came after, he would have done everything in his power to avoid that from happening. You know what I mean? Like, and I do think that had he not died accidentally, he would have come around. I do think I
Oh,
definitely
I have a very strong faith that he would have come around and resolved things because he already was feeling guilty for what he was putting us through. Like he had expressed that more than once. And
well, not even
you know
yeah,
that
not
that
even
is
like
something that I have full confidence in, and that at some
yeah,
point he would have gotten through it and been better off for
right.
it on the other end.
Yeah. I think the journey would have probably been just as difficult in different ways. I don't think it would have it it he was such in the beginning process of it that, like,
Hmm. I
you know,
mean,
it
we're never
still
gonna
would have
know.
been it still would have been difficult, but I do believe
Yeah.
that he would have pulled through.
One other thing too, after his relapse, I remember the only thing I remember between his relapse and when he died, there's two things. I remember the phone call I had with him on Tuesday night, 2 days, well, 2 days before. So he would have died Wednesday night at like 10 o'clock, and we found out Thursday. But the last time I talked to him was Tuesday night, and I don't remember the full thing of the conversation. He called me while I was on my way home from work, and it was a pretty brief call, but you know, I will say that I'm happy that the last thing that we had said to each other was that we loved each other. You know, that was the last thing I ever said to him was that I love him. But the other thing that I remember is, in regards to the relapse, because he obviously like was in therapy and doing all of that stuff. He was talking to his therapist about it, and he shared this with us, kind of in the way that his therapist um gave an illustration or an analogy as to what happened and why he relapsed that he seemingly really resonated with, which was, at least the way he
And
explained it.
honestly, it totally made sense to us too. It was a good analogy for us to be able to understand it as well.
Yeah, because I mean, again, at that point, we didn't have the same knowledge about this process that we do now, but which was essentially that, like, alcohol for a long time has been your best friend. You love your best friend. You want to hang out with your best friend all the time, but you realize it's a toxic relationship that's bringing you down and ruining your other relationships. It's like that friend that always convinces you to do dumb things and always convinces you to. It's bad association, right? And so you've done a good job so far of cutting things off and avoiding doing things with your friend until one day you're at the store and you see your friend at the store. And because that was the other thing is we're like, what made you relapse? And I think he said something along the lines of like he was just walking, he was just in the store and can't, and saw the alcohol there and just grabbed a bottle and bought it and brought it home. And like it was just as simple of like that temptation of seeing it there, you know. And so the
Yeah, it
therapist,
wasn't anything crazy. It was
it
literally I don't
wasn't it
even think he
wasn't
had
like he was super sad. It wasn't like he was going through having a moment and he wanted to feel better. It was literally just like, yeah, I was doing
he didn't
fine.
even understand it.
Yeah, he didn't even he's like, why, we were like, why did you, why did you relapse? And he's like, I don't know. I was just walking in the store and I saw a bottle of vodka and before I knew it, I was at home drinking, you know. And the therapist basically said like, yeah, you ran into your best friend at the store and he asked you to hang out. And against your better judgment, you said, yeah, sure, we can just, one more time, like the good old days, and
Mhm.
that's what happened. And it doesn't and that's part of addiction, that's part of relapse, it's part like any sort of addiction, whether it be alcohol, drug related, or whether it be gambling or any of the other, you know, millions of things you can become addicted to. When you're trying to set yourself free from that, relapse is a part of the process. It's almost, it's very, very rare that people don't relapse at some point or another. And it could be a week in, could be 3 months in, could be 2 years in, could be 10 years in. It doesn't matter. It oftentimes happens at one point or another. And like you said earlier, it's not about the relapse itself. It's not it may feel like a setback or that you're starting over, but it's not. You've made so much progress already. One little relapse is not starting over. It's just a small setback, like you've taken
It's how you
20
move
steps.
forward.
Right. You've taken 20 steps forward. You had a relapse. Now you've taken 2 steps back. Well, you're still a lot farther along than you were at the start,
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
and
again,
I
it's do you move forward or um that setback make you crash and burn?
yeah. And I think that that's where societal stigma comes in, and these biases and opinions we have about what drug addiction is, or who a drug addict is, or who an alcoholic is, or whatever. And so there's so much shame and embarrassment that comes with relapse, because are there is a school of thought that it's like, if you relapse, like, you've made the biggest mistake in the world, your life is over, like, now you have to you've ruined all the progress you've made. And the reality is that, like you said, relapse is part of the process of recovery. And sometimes the relapses are what teach you the things you need to continue to grow in your recovery.
Well,
And it's not
sometimes on that same line, the relapse is what teaches you how bad it actually affects your life. Because sometimes, you
that as
know,
well.
things start to get way better, right? And you're like, oh, things are going good in my life, things are whatever. And then you're like, maybe I can handle it again. And you try it,
Yeah.
and then everything, and then you realize, oh, this is what my life was like.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can be that kind of realization as well. And
And
go ahead.
I was just going to say, so, again, I think that as a society, as a culture, as people who I, I would bet at this point in time, all of us know at least one person that has issues with substances, right? Um, is to take that judgment and that bias and that stigma out of the equation, recognize that relapse is something that will happen. It's not about the fact that the person relapse, it's about what they do after they relapse. So there is sometimes people who, because they don't feel safe in using their resources to say, I messed up and I had a few drinks, or I took some pills, or I went on a bender, or I shot up, or I did this. And then there's a shame spiral that happens. And then they just are like, well, I've already messed it up. Might as well just keep going. Right.
Yeah,
And so
I'm
if
so
we,
stupid. I can't control myself. You go through that negative self-talk spiral, and
right,
it gets you to a it's very quickly that you get to a point where you're like, well,
screw
I'm
it.
just going to mess it up
I,
anyway, so screw
yep,
it. I'm just going to, jump right back in the
exactly.
pool.
And so, what is so important for the people who surround someone who is in recovery is to really go and be with them in no judgment about their thing that they're dealing with, right? It's if you're having a hard time and you feel like you want to use or you feel like you might relapse, you can come and talk to me. I am not going to judge you. I will say, what do you need? What is going to help you? What's the next, like, what's your tools? You have a meeting. Do you have whatever? I'll drive you there. Like, or if someone comes,
Love is a much stronger motivator than judgment.
yes. And
Judgment will often lead somebody onto the path, uh that
they
onto the
start to
negative
hide it.
path.
They hide
Yeah.
it
It
because they again, there's shame. It's shame and embarrassment and guilt and all the negative feelings that come with it. And I said that to my sister when she was in recovery. I said, it's inevitable you're going to make mistakes at some point. It's not about making the mistakes, it's about what you do afterwards. So if you ever are in that place where you are feeling tempted or you did trip up and make a mistake, it's not about the fact that you make a mistake. It's like, what did you do afterwards to fix it? Right. Like, so, like, if
mm.
you made a mistake,
What lessons did you learn?
there's something you let slip, right? Like, everybody, as they go through their recovery path, they find a process that works for them, whether it's going to AA meetings, NA meetings, whether there's a program they're involved in, whether they have a therapist, a psychiatrist, they have some sort of community that they're involved. There's something that they do on a regular basis that keeps them accountable and focused on their sobriety. Like, it's like managing a disease. It's like having diabetes where you have to check your glucose, your blood sugar every day, and adjust your foods and maybe take some insulin and all that stuff. Like, that's what addiction is. Like, you have to manage it every minute of every day and be on top of it. And so you put systems in place, and that's what recovery is about. You put systems in place that keep you on track with your health. And so when someone relapses, it means that there's something in their system, something in their process, in their support system that has been helping them stay in recovery that has broken down, whether it's they're not talking to their sponsor anymore, they don't have the community that they've been involved in, they've stopped going to therapy. There's something that they're not doing that they were doing before. And so the best thing you can do when somebody trips is to help them back up, is not to kick them while they're down because and be like, "Here, you're an awful person, like, how dare you?" It's to help them analyze, like, "Okay, what are you missing? Like, when's the last time you did this? What tool haven't you been using that you need to start using again?"
When I think on that same point, oftentimes people like that, or people in general, when they make a mistake, they're their own biggest critic. They're already judging themselves. They're already kicking themselves. Like, there is nobody. I would venture to bet that there is nobody in this world except for full blown narcissists and sociopaths, psychopaths, that sort of thing. Like, where it's a clinical issue, but like nobody in this world makes a mistake and then thinks highly of themselves afterwards. You know, like,
Right.
you're kicking most of the time. You kick yourself when you're down already. You're already your worst enemy, and then if you have somebody else who comes and does it too, it just reaffirms everything you already think about yourself. And so there is this common, when people relapse, it's dangerous because if they don't have the support that they need, they'll just jump right back in the deep end of the pool because might as well. I'm already messed up. I'm already screwing it all up. I'm never gonna get better. I can't do it. You know, and they beat themselves down, and then it's like, well, what else? What else can I do?
Right.
And again, that's where that love and compassion comes in versus judgment, because that's again why it's my biggest regret in this whole thing was the moment that he needed it the most, I kicked him while he was down. He probably already thought all of those things towards himself already. And that's the part that hurts me the most is that
Yeah.
you know, the other thing that's dangerous about relapse, I was going to say, is
Uh-huh.
I think people often forget or often don't realize that relapse is dangerous for like overdoses and things, especially because
Uh-huh.
if you've been sober for alcohol or opiates or whatever else the substance may be, especially if you've been sober for a certain amount of time, your body goes back to baseline and it's not used. Usually with addiction, as the addiction progresses, your tolerance goes up and up and up and up and up. So, whether it's cocaine or opiates or alcohol or whatever, in order to get that same effect in your body, you have to drink more, you have to take more, you have to snort more, you have to shoot up more, whatever, whatever. Um, when you go sober, all of that, your tolerance goes right back down eventually, especially if you've been sober for long enough. And it doesn't
Yeah.
take long, a month or two, and your tolerance is back to baseline. Problem is people don't realize that. And then
Yeah.
when they relapse thinking that they can handle as much as they could before. And
Mhm.
like that's a huge thing that we see in the emergency room a lot. I've literally had recently patients, come in where they've been sober for months, for weeks, for years, whatever, and they came in with an overdose because they relapsed one time and they tried to do as much as they thought they could before and their body couldn't handle it anymore. And so they overdosed.
The highest risk for overdose deaths is after you've been sober for a while.
Especially with opiates.
Mhm.
That's I would say the most common.
Yep.
But like I mean, we see it all the time where yeah, I've been sober for months and and my friend gave me some pills and I took a bunch and I took what I normally take and now I'm
Yeah.
here in the hospital, getting Narcan
Yeah.
or whatever. And that's something that people don't really realize is like it's the same thing. It's the same reason why, if you're drinking on a fairly regular basis or whatever, and then you go a couple weeks where you haven't had anything to drink, maybe before you could have 3, 4 drinks without really feeling a whole lot. You go a while without drinking, and then you have one drink, and you're like, whoa, you know.
Yeah. Yep.
It's because your tolerance went back down. Um,
Yeah.
and
And
so I
just to
just
kinda oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, and I think just kinda going back to the fact that, like, you felt, like the conversation you had with him when he relapsed, um, I mean, the thing that you didn't know, that we just touched on briefly before we started recording this episode is you'd caught him that one day on a Friday and found his alcohol and found that he had actually in fact been drinking and was intoxicated. You were going to be gone for the weekend. I was working overnights, which meant I would be sleeping during the day. I didn't know um
After he died,
until after he died when I had access to all of his stuff, and the man was like
receipts and all that stuff.
he was religious about keeping all his stuff for his job, and like just he kept all the evidence on himself, let's just put it that way. um And so, after he died, I did learn that it was a 3-day relapse. So it was a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, which made sense. You were gone for the weekend. I was working my overnight shift for the weekend. He was on his own. He relapsed the one day. When you caught him and threw that bottle out,
That was
I
day
don't know
one.
that he That was day 1, but I don't know that he went back and bought more bottles. I did find receipts of him that weekend. Again, this was 3 weeks before he died. That weekend going to there's a local sports bar, like, a mile down the road from our house at that time, and having beverages there. Not, like, excessive. He wasn't excessive, just but he was having them, so he was drinking that weekend, so it was more like a 3-day relapse. I do remember that this was the time. So not only did you talk about how he had brought it up with his therapist and had this very enlightening conversation, which I think is a great analogy for a lot of people around the friendship thing. You break up with a toxic friend. Sometimes you want to go hang out with that friend again. You see him, you bump
What?
into him,
And
right?
you don't think about them until they're, oh yeah, I ran into him at the store, or I ran into him
And they're
randomly, and they're
fun.
like,
They're
oh hey, let's go hang out real quick, and
Yeah,
you got
and
some
they are
time.
fun. You remember the fun times with them. They're fun people. They're fun friends until they're not
And
fun
then
anymore.
things get out of hand and you get in trouble, and
Right.
yeah, it's
But I do remember after that weekend, because obviously when I was done working and, had time to address what exactly had happened, um, we had like a family meeting where we sat in the living room with your dad and we're trying to figure out like what happened and like what do we need to do as a family to address like to help you with this, right? And this is where you can tell that he was still very early on in his recovery process because he was like, I don't need anything. I can fix this myself. Like it was just a slip up. It'll be fine. I can fix this myself. And I very specifically, clearly remember saying to him, this is not this addiction is not an individual problem. It's a family issue. Like it is an issue that affects everyone in the family. The whole dynamic contributes to the issue in some form or fashion. In his case, it was this pattern of lying, and it created this weird divide and some distancing between us where we had not had it before. Um, and so it was like, we all have to work together in order for you to get better. But he still very much had this mentality that it's my problem. I'll fix it. It's not something you guys have to worry about. And I remember specifically being really frustrated about that because he didn't see the fact that this was affecting, or I don't know that he didn't see it. He wasn't acknowledging or didn't want to acknowledge the fact that this actually impacted all of us and that him just fixing it on his own without including us wasn't really going to fix it? So I do remember that happening after that relapse.
yeah. And
And
I
then he
think I think
died.
like a yeah, I was gonna say, I think the hardest part about that whole situation is he relapsed, and before we could even figure out what to do about it or how to help him, or
And it was a
you
short
know,
relapse, like a
yeah,
few days, and then he was,
yeah, back on
3 weeks
back on
later.
track, and then suddenly he was gone, and like, like I said, like we said last episode, and then even into this one, like he was doing so good, he was trying so hard. He had one slip
Yeah,
up, and then we were trying to figure out how to deal with that in an effective way, and we were doing our best as a family, and then before we even had a chance
yeah,
to help or to figure anything out, he was gone.
yeah.
Hey, you know how this works.
If you like this episode or just like us in general, you can find us at It's Going Podcast on all the things.
Don't forget to check out the links in the description.
And thanks for hanging out with us.